Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Union for Easter term. Tonight, we're debating a timeless issue which we've considered in many different forms many times before. In 1991, we debated this House calls for private state school quotas to make Oxbridge less elitist. In 1993, we debated this House believes that private schools are not in the public interest. And in 2019, we debated this House would nationalise Eton. The motion before the House tonight is that this House believes private schools are a force for good. Before we hear from our guests, I'll run through how the debate will work, as we have both members and non-members in the House tonight. So firstly, we'll have a round of paper speeches. There'll be 10 minutes each, starting with proposition and then moving to opposition. After that, I'll open to the floor. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our student members tonight. And students can make speeches in proposition, opposition, and abstention. Please keep these between 1 to 2 minutes and state your name and college beforehand for the minutes. We'll then hear from our paper speakers again in proposition, then opposition. Then we'll have the floor speeches again, and then we'll have a final round with the closing paper speakers. Do remember that it is your right to interrupt at any time by saying points of information on that point or something to that end while a speech is going on. You may repeat this if the speaker doesn't hear you, but please note, they don't have to take your point. Without further ado, let's begin the debate with our first paper speaker, Aatif Hassan. Aatif is the chairman and founder of the Cavendish Education Group, a grouping of schools that focus on supporting neurodivergent students and those with additional needs. Aatif, you have the ears of the House.
President, fellow speakers, members of the Union, ladies and gentlemen, the motion that is being proposed this evening, that this House believes private schools are a force for a good, is a topic I am dearly, dearly passionate about, alongside the 4,000 staff that I employ. And it's something that I have decided to spend the rest of my career doing. I speak from the engine room, the front line, the classroom. I'm in the fold. I'm not qualified. I've not written a book. I've not published a paper. But I speak from talking to staff, parents, and young people on a daily basis. And we should be absolutely clear. We are talking about private schools, what we call independent schools, as a whole. And they range from prestigious boarding schools, names you will have heard of, to low-cost, rural, small day schools, to specialist, art, music, dance schools, to a topic very close, dear to my heart, special needs schools. And all in all, the 2,500 schools with 600,000 children, representing 7% of the students in this country. And of that 600,000, 95,000, and a fast-growing trend, are on the SEN register, the SEND register. And that's the official number. And for someone who works day in, day out in a series of schools, 70 settings all in all, I can tell you the number is probably double that. To give you a bit more context into where I come from, I attended a state school myself until the age of 13. My father got that dreaded phone call and I was asked to be removed. I found myself, and my father exerted his human right choice to send me to a small independent school. And let's be absolutely clear, he was an immigrant who came to this country with a suitcase and a few pounds in his pocket. he substituted his savings, restaurants, holidays, and other discretionary spend to choose to send me to that school. I was nurtured, I was supported, I was influenced, and that led me to go on to get a first-class degree, a British military commission, and an award-winning and successful city career, working with some fantastic people. But in 2013, after a series of life events, I decided to found Cavendish Education, and in 2015, Duke's Education. And I'll come and talk about those very briefly. Cavendish is a group of 15 schools for children who we call unique learning profiles, commonly referred to dyslexia and all the way to high-functioning autism. And ladies and gentlemen, I am proudly blessed with dyslexia, and I had the naughty boy syndrome, which now is modern-day ADHD. My children in my schools are 80% funded by the state. 80% funded by the state. We get a tariff, a fee that the government, through the Department of Education, through the local authority funding cycles, that they dictate. We pay our staff market, because that's what you have to do. We have to buy our own buildings, rent them, purchase them, and we still manage to generate a surplus which we can reinvest in the organization. But it's not just an economic point I want to make, because the real value in my Cavendish schools, in the 15 schools I have, and the reason why they're oversubscribed and parents struggle to find a place in them, is because of outcomes. The outcomes are world-class. They're the very best in the country, competing with charities, competing with state provision and provisions outside of the UK. In a measure of value add, from the measure where you come into a school to the measure when you leave, my schools are in the top few percent. And actually, Breedon School, based in the Cotswolds, was #1 in the country. So of all the schools measured, from the point a student comes in, this is real change, to the point you leave, it was #1 in the country. Half of my children who come into my school leave going on to further education. And these are children who have been written off by their previous schools, written off by the state system, and for many of those parents, survival is the only outcome they're after. And for many of the others, they go off to employment, or work with us, or work with other organizations. And the government are obsessed by this stat in NEETs, in Cavendish Education, with a cohort of entirely dyslexic, entirely autistic children. Our NEET percentage is 0. Now, this is truly world-class, and we are talking about, are we a force for a good? Surely, we should be embracing it. We should be extending it. We should be inviting more state children into our schools. I would argue for more outsourcing, and I would argue we don't take away something which is genuinely world-class. So the question, if you're all able to hear, is, given the success of Cavendish, why don't we publicize and influence others to do good? Mum, we're a young organization founded in 2013. We sit on the industry boards, we work with charities, we're able to use our influence in a small way, but I would love to do more. We've gone 0 to 15 schools in 8 years, and we're growing, opening as fast as we can. But I would love for this country to embrace the private sector in that pace of change. But you've got to ask yourself, why? Why isn't the state doing this? In the time that you've been in education, for the students in this lobby, you will have seen 11 education ministers in your time. There's no long-term thinking. The decisions, the investments, the strategies that I put in place for my organization mean at the ripe age of 43, as I am, I'm looking to be working in Cavendish and my fellow organization, Duke's, which looks after mainstream schools, for 20 plus years. You then have the economic argument of taxation. These 600,000 children, if they were to go to a state school, would cost the government $6,000 per child. And that's let alone the cost of actually building the schools. In the National Audit Commission, they cited a report in 2019 that the Building for Schools program were costing the senior execs £750,000 each, and the overuse of consultants, and a real waste of taxpayers' money. Why don't you just let us do it? Save that funding, give us more access, use this national resource for real benefit. Ladies and gentlemen, we have great institutions. It's world renowned. Not only do we generate savings from taxation, but Britain's education system is known around the world. People come to universities like this one because the British education system is known. It generates billions for the economy, and I am absolutely positive that my schools...
If your suggestion is that you can save taxpayer money by giving it to the private sector, what happens to parents that can't afford to send their kids to specialist SEN schools? I'm highly neurodivergent. My parents could never have afforded to me. I never had the luxuries that your father never had either. Yet my parents still never had the money to send me private. What happens to those kids when the whole sector of special educational needs has been sold off to the private one under the name of taxation?
Sir. Sir, you are supporting the point I'm making. 80% of the students in Cavendish are non-fee paying. So they access state funding into independent education.
Can I be delighted that you have so many non-fee paying students, but can we take into account that just over 50% of the students that have special educational needs that request an SEN support from the state, 100% goes to tribunal, 97% of those cases are in favour of parent school use support, yet each county only admits approximately 50% of those children to your school with study. So there's 50% still in each county that don't get to access to schools.
Mum, and I agree. I agree, the need is great, but the solution is to extend the provision that we have. It is a crying shame, the stats that you read out. I really believe we are a force for good. I really believe we can do more. In the world of fundamentalism, in war, division, we need more unity. This is what I teach our children every day in our schools. Let's come together. Why have the divide between state and independent? Let's use this resource to come together to provide this amazing facility so we can extend, as you say. Ladies and gentlemen, we are a force for good. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Order, please. Order. 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 Thank you. We now move to our opposition speaker, Professor Francis Green. Francis Green is a professor of work and education economics at UCL. Professor Green co-authored Engines of Privilege, Britain's Private School Problem, in which he argues that private schools undermine social mobility, meritocracy, and democracy. Francis, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Britain's private schools began, as you probably know, many centuries ago, with the mission to offer education to bring education to local poor families who could not afford the private tutors that the aristocratic families employed, but they have evolved to become a symbol and focal point for all that is unfair about modern British society. I don't need to lecture you of all audiences as to the importance of education in society, especially in a modern democratic society where people dare aspire to a fair chance in life, as long as they work hard and contribute. And schools are at the centre of our hopes. So what this debate really matters is what I'm saying there. But our segmented and divided school system is simply getting in the way, and that's the case I'm going to make tonight. First of all, social exclusivity. The fees are now so eye-wateringly huge, and access is out of reach for most people. That's just a simple fact. For those people who do not have the family wealth to fall back on. The well-known top schools, particularly, charge in excess of £40,000 a year. Imagine paying that throughout a child's time in secondary school. Add to that the time at their prep schools and all the brothers and sisters. Think poor besieged Boris Johnson, for example. And the schooling of a family might cost more than £1 million, I joke not. And the education system that we have here has got this huge chasm, therefore, between the resources available to the private sector and the resources available to state school children. Estimates are very difficult to get because of the opaqueness of the private sector, but they are between 2 and 3. That's between 200 and 300% more resources per child go into the private sector than go into the average state sector. And what do you get for your money? The golden ticket. Let's not think that that money is necessarily wasted by the parents who do have the money to spend. You get to mix with other affluent pupils. You benefit enormously from small class sizes, half as big, and excellent classroom facilities, as well as the lavish cultural and sporting amenities. Some of you will be familiar with them, some here will be familiar. And scientific research shows that the money does make a difference to your prospects. It does improve exam results, even allowing for the contextual factors. The privately educated tend to go to higher-ranking universities, and through their networks and their cultural capital, they tend to earn more when they get into the labour market. They marry other people who earn more, and they have a disproportionate influence on public life. Now, the defenders of private schools will try to spin it that their schools in particular, are not socially exclusive, and that you meet a real cross-section of British life at their gates. Well, that might be defensible in a few schools, in some schools, but the systematic facts are really quite different. Despite private schools' efforts to share their facilities occasionally in order to defend their tax-free charitable status, the system overall remains thoroughly divided and segmented. So I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, how can an institution that is the fountain of so much unfairness of life chances in British society be thought of as good for society in general? Perhaps you might wonder, well, it's a shame about the inequality and the unfairness, but life's unfair, and anyway, Britain as a whole benefits from the good education of our elites. You might want to throw in a bit about the foreign earnings. Something like 10% of private school children have foreign parents, including the Russian ones, I might add. Yet it stands to reason that it would be better to devote more, not less, of our educational resources to children in disadvantaged areas. So I'm going to now quote you from a recent wide-ranging summary of scientific studies. Excuse me for doing the nerdish bit, but I'm the academic here and I read the scientific studies. It concludes that increases in resources are usually found to be more effective in disadvantaged schools and/or on disadvantaged students at all phases of education. That's summarizing a lot of studies. Economists among you might recognize here the law of diminishing marginal product. The scientific study goes on to say, It is more efficient as well as equitable to target resources at disadvantaged students. Well, of course, but in Britain, private schooling system, we do the opposite. So, not an overall benefit then. What about diversity? You might say private schools provide diversity, and diversity is good for education. Well, actually, I'd agree with that, probably. I think that diversity, certainly without segregation, is up to a point beneficial. And I would support that, having choice and differences amongst the choices available. But why should diversity be private? Why should it be exclusive to just a few? Perfectly possible, in my view, to have diverse, properly funded options, including for special needs children, within a comprehensive state system. Okay, you might say, well, no matter if education is so unequal, and so education suffers overall, but how does that harm our society? I mean, I'm taking this motion seriously here. It's supposed to be good for our society. How's it good or bad for our society? Well, I ask you, how can it be good for our society if 65% of our senior judges are drawn just from the small pool of under 7% of children who earlier had the privilege of private schooling? And whether you're Conservative or Labour, Lib Dem or Green, can it really be good government if half or more of our government ministers stem from a tiny group? If the majority of diplomats who represent Britain abroad are picked from the same pool? Not to mention the BBC executives, the columnists, the heads of footsie companies, and so on. All groups with high establishment influence on society in Britain are disproportionately peopled by those who have been to private school. Does it really help in getting good policies for state education if over the last 50 years, 3 out of 5 education ministers have been privately educated? Wouldn't it be better if our rulers and influencers had rubbed shoulders as they were growing up with a broader cross-section of our society? We suffer, ladies and gentlemen, from a democratic deficit in our private school-dominated society. Well, you might wonder whether it makes any difference that private school pupils are largely segmented from everyone else as they grow up. But it does. Indeed, I'll quote you a bit more science now. Social psychologists studying groups and group psychology call it the contact hypothesis. It's quite simple, really. Little contact with outside groups, in this case those not at private school, leads to biased perceptions about and by those outsiders, and at worst, of course, sheer prejudice. I'll take it quickly, yeah?
I'm not an expert on this, but it seems as if private schools didn't exist, surely you'd have all the same problems. You'd have catchment areas in which people have shadow houses just to be able to go to those schools. So surely it's a much deeper problem, and actually the private school isn't the...
Okay, so I'm not going to deny that there aren't inequalities within the state sector based on local areas. You're quite right to make that point. But let me tell you this, the differences between the various schoolings in the state sector are just a fraction of the 200 or 300% difference, the enormous chasm between the private sector and the state sector. If you were to reform private schools, we wouldn't be living in heaven, but it's, in my view, well, it's a step towards it. I'll come to that later. I need to get through to the end of my speech, so I'll take it later if I have time, if I may. So, let me quote from some of the people who've been on the inside of government. This is to try and illustrate my problem, my point about the lack of empathy. One of them says this: from ministers, officials and business leaders bonding over where they went to school or sent their children, through to the colleague who told me that growing up she didn't know anyone who was state educated, it feels like we have a ruling elite that has no personal experience of state education. And here's another government insider who concludes talking about high-ranking, privately educated civil servants. He says, from his experience, most in my experience have very poor knowledge of the issues they are making decisions on and have very little empathy with the people affected by the policies they are making. So let me then sum up what I'm really saying. This is the argument, in short. The private school, state school divide in Britain supports unequal life chances. It inhibits social mobility in our society, and it spawns a ruling elite, many of whom have never mixed with ordinary people, and potentially wastes the talent of many who live outside that gilded zone. For me, the sooner we reform our segmented, divided system of education, the better. This does not mean bulldozing our way through historic institutions or even new and great institutions like the one we've just heard about, but gradually opening them up to all and not just on the basis of academic selection. If this means less money spent on educating the richest, then so be it. If we want to have better schools, we have to begin to tackle the absurd educational apartheid in this country. For me, I've nearly finished actually, so I will just finish if I may. For me, each child should be given as fair a chance as possible for development, aspiration, and achievement in life. And for me, the rich can be left to spend their money after taxes as they wish on other things, as long as they're legal, of course. But in education, we should all, rich and poor alike, partake of the same school system with the same opportunities for choice and diversity. And I invite you all to vote against this rather depressing motion that defends the establishment and the status quo which lies before us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. We'll now move to floor speeches. We'll do one in proposition, one in opposition, and one in abstention. Please keep these 1 to 2 minutes. I will have to cut you off otherwise. And name and college before you start. Would anyone like to speak in proposition of the motion?
Thank you. Zachary Marsh, Robinson College. I'm very fortunate. I'm a graduate when I say my college name, and I now work as a state school teacher, so it might surprise some of you that I'm standing on this side of the house tonight. I just wanted to mention a little bit about what was said there about inequality, because I think that the first speaker on the opposition, despite making some excellent points, completely misled the House on the scale of inequality we have within our state sector. And in fact, when we talk about private schools, we really are talking about the emotional tip of the iceberg rather than what lies underneath. I'll tell you what the biggest determinant of success in this city today is. It's whether you're born in Arbury or born in Chesterton. If you go to a school in the right part of Cambridge, you'll have an educational experience very, very similar to those who attend the many private schools in this city. You'll go into a school where you mix with similarly middle-class children whose parents went to universities, who insist that you do your homework every night in a calm environment, who will ensure that you go on to university as they will have done. If you are born in the wrong parts of a city like Cambridge, you will go home to a fractured family that have faced decades and potentially generations of deprivation. And those schools that struggle are harmed by the very policies that exist within our state system. So when we talk about whether private schools are good, I think we should at least consider the reflection, the state system. Because when you look at the state system, you look at the scandalous off-rolling of pupils that good state schools can't be bothered to deal with, which they send to struggling state schools in difficult areas, compounding the problem. When you look at the ability of state schools that are oversubscribed to essentially pick and choose their intake, to select effectively for wealth, whether that be through catchment areas or on the basis of SEND statistics or dyslexia or reading and writing skills. Sorry, did someone say something? Yes, absolutely.
Is the plan then not to reform state schools and follow them rather than...
Yeah, absolutely right, absolutely. Completely agree with you. But we're not talking about spending one iota more on state schools as a result of this motion. Parents who send their children to private schools already pay tax to replace their child as not taking up in the state sector. In fact, as the first proposition speaker accurately pointed out, the worst thing we could do short term would be to send 600,000 more students into the state sector. It would crush it overnight. for not one penny more in funding. So if we care about poor state school children growing up in disadvantage, perhaps we should look down from our ivory towers, from our moral indignation, and consider the fact that if you work in a school in Arbury, your best friend is the private school that offers your kids who want to get out free tuition, to go there for sixth form, to get ahead, to get a chance in life, rather than the state schools who consistently offload the pupils that they can't be bothered to deal with anymore, the children with dyslexia, with autism, into schools where they're only going to struggle further and resources are not going to extend any further. So if we're going to talk about whether British education is good, no, it's not. But are private schools the root of the rot that is causing our educational problem? No, if anything, as the proposition speaker said, they're probably the solution at the moment to the inequality we face within our own house. And I think we should look to our own house before we throw stones in glass houses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zachary. Would anyone like to speak in opposition?
Hannah Simoyoki, Pembroke College. It's a bit of a dangerous game to make a floor speech at this point in the proceedings, because probably someone will come along, eliminate my argument, or argue it far better than I can in the 3 minutes that I've spent thinking about this. But the reason I would like to make this speech in the opposition today is not because I don't think private schools are good in and of themselves. I'm sure, based on the many stories I've heard of those who are actually lucky enough to go to one, like my younger brothers, that they have a great outcome for those who do experience them. I find it quite annoying when people bring up the Finnish education system all the time, but I actually am Finnish, so I'm going to use that privilege to quickly talk about something. Finland basically doesn't have private schools. Other than the few religious ones, it just kind of isn't really a thing. And it's much easier to have a good education system when it's not based on a changing roster of education ministers who all have different grand theories, having never been anywhere near a classroom since they were 16 and at Eton. But in principle, allowing everybody to, at least in theory, have access to the same sorts of schools, the same level of education, is so much better than the current seemingly only solution of those who are lucky enough, who get a big enough bursary, whose parents earn enough to go and actually experience that good education that gives, as we've acknowledged, so many advantages. And I'm sure most people here didn't go to private schools statistically, but we've been lucky enough to get a good education, or, in fact, just to work hard enough for ourselves to be here. And there are so many other people who probably also deserved a place here, who would have been able to reach that potential had they been given the resources. And in the system that we have today, that's not possible. It's not Eton's fault, it's not the grammar school's fault that it's like that. But were private schools not to exist, simply, do you think the parents who are paying those crazy amounts of money for their children's education would put up with what they'd find at an inner city school, or any of the many state schools that do not offer, quite frankly, what every child deserves? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Would anyone like to make a speech in abstention?
Owen Cooper, Selwyn College. So, ultimately, I'm proud of many of our great British institutions, such as our monarchy, Her Majesty's Police Force and Prison Service, and of course our great universities like Oxford and Cambridge. However, ultimately, as an individual who went to a state school, which wasn't great, it was overcrowded, filling up with additional feeder schools, it had a problem with drugs, a lack of qualified teachers in certain areas, even things like having to get rid of A-level music, never mind subjects like Latin, which might be taught in private schools. They had to get rid of A-level music simply because there just wasn't enough funding. However, regardless of this, I strived. I got 5 A stars at A-level. I experienced the struggles of some of the poorest students in Sheffield, where I grew up. And ultimately, I did all of this for free. The reason that I'm giving an abstention speech tonight, I suppose, is that ultimately I believe that I could have achieved my personal place at Cambridge, regardless of whether I'd have gone to that state school or a private school. So ultimately, I urge the House to abstain on this motion because I believe that ultimately our great British state schools can offer the opportunities to get to this sort of place. Thank you.
Thank you. Order, please. Order. 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 Thank you. Okay. Now we move on to our second proposition speaker, John Southworth. John Southworth is the chair of the Independent Schools Association, working with nearly 600 schools across the UK. He is the principal of Mander, Portman, Woodward in London, and previously spent 20 years as an officer in the British Army. John, you have the ears of the House.
President, speakers, members of this union, esteemed guests, thank you for inviting me here tonight and for your kind and generous hospitality. Yes, I attended a private school. I taught predominantly at private schools, and I've been the principal of 2 private schools. I find the phrase private school actually rather strange to start with, as these types of schools are very much under continuous public scrutiny, so are hardly private in their nature. However, they are schools fundamentally, and are certainly not a force for evil. So by default, they must be a force for good. My background, and so my credentials for speaking to you this evening are that I completed my education at a private, direct grant school, attended university, spent 20 years in the army serving our country. I decided then to take a change of direction in my career to become a teacher. I wanted to give something back because teachers can transform lives, as I believe my teachers did when I was a much younger man with probably rather more hair. I wanted to help young people develop into fine adults who could make the world a better place. I did not particularly plan to teach in the independent or private sector, but serendipity meant that I have ended up where I am. I'm now the principal of a college in London and was elected by nearly 600 heads to be the chair of the Independent Schools Association. So my intention has always been about providing the best education for the pupils in my care, regardless of what type of school they are or I am in. I want students to be safe and happy and to leave my school as better people following the education they have received. I know that brilliant things can be done in both state schools and in private schools. So for me, it is about schools. It's all about schools, which are places that can have a huge positive impact on young people and therefore on the world in which they live. All schools, undoubtedly, are an enormous force for good. It is therefore a strange debate that even entertains the possibility that there's a big chunk of these schools in this country that are not doing at least some good. Private, independent schools comprise over 2,500 schools, providing education for over 600,000 pupils each year. And just like any other school, they are a force for good. So do my opponents this evening, President, really think that simply because a school is private, it suddenly stops educating children, inspiring them, and transforming young lives? I hope not. To vote for this motion, I believe that you, in fact, only need to be convinced that it is possible in at least one case that a pupil in a private school has been a force for good, as that surely makes that private school a force for good too. Allow me to give you a compelling example of how a private school has transformed a life positively for the good. Call her pupil R. Attended my school when I was principal. They were partially sighted and could not find a state school who could support their educational needs and care locally. I gave them a substantial bursary, brought in specialist teachers, and ultimately transformed their life chances to allow them to take and pass exams, move on to university, and they are now contributing brilliantly to society. Surely, just this one personal example is is a force for good, because there was, please.
If one pupil is served well and
I would say, I think I said earlier, I strive to give every one of my students the very, very best education I can possibly do. And I strive all the time to make sure they get the best education that my teachers can give them. I'll come to you, please, in a moment. I would also like to give you two brief examples of schools within my association that I'm particularly proud of. Beach Lodge School, for example, one of my favourites, started by a mother of a child with severe issues who had no state provision who could care for that child. So she started a school to help pupils with the most severe dyslexia and serious attachment disorders. She now helps 66 pupils aged between 5 and 19, and she does truly amazing work. Kensington Wade School, a 3 to 11 prep school, truly bilingual. Children are taught lessons in either English or Mandarin. Their aim is to create an immersive experience to prepare children for a global future. Why would we prevent parents the chance to do this? Please.
Sorry, bashing the Finnish thing again. They do that, and it's an entirely state system. No one doubts that private school can do good things. No one doubts these providing great purposes. So I think a lot of people just think that the state system could be able to do this, and in fact should be, instead of having that sort of private school.
What? As an educator, I'm not an academic, I don't think, but I'm an educator, I concur. I believe what we should be doing, actually, is levelling up the state system, not levelling down the independent sector. Just because private schools are delivering excellence and choice, and I think the key thing here is they deliver choice. And it's not only a choice for the young people in those schools, but it's a choice for parents. And I think what the state system needs to do... No, it is accessible to everyone, because if you let me...
Order.
It is accessible. There are 7% of the population or pupils in independent schools. Of those, 1/3 are in receipt of some form of bursary assistance. So independent schools, private schools, are continuing now creating partnerships with state schools. There are thousands and thousands of partnerships in place that are allowing its private schools and state schools to join forces to work together. Let me give you an example of a school where I taught down the road from here. My director of sport there used to go out once a week to local schools with all his sports equipment, to local schools that could not afford it. And that equipment allowed those students at those schools to suddenly take part in fantastic sports competitions that they couldn't do because they were not funded by the state system. But for some, it is not about choice. It is about opening doors that would previously be tight shut. The pupils with early life trauma, birth accidents, serious learning needs, for whom sadly there is not enough money, support, or it seems sometimes desire to help them. I'll come to you. They need the private sector to allow them to have a decent chance to succeed in life, rather than be condemned to the woefully inadequate provision in the state system, unable to meet their specific needs. Surely, as I said before, we should be levelling the state system up, rather than criticising the private sector for doing so much good and being a force for good. Yes?
I went to a private school, and in a particular way, they are not so much responsible because of it. It's then racism and homophobia and transphobia, and the people who did get bursaries, they were bullied, there was so much bullying, it was such a toxic environment. And what you can say is that so maybe the actual private school institution itself is being forced to do it, but those people who are different, they are picked on, and they actually have a diminished capacity to actually get somewhere in life because of mental health issues. And it's in that way that we say that it can't be a force for good because the people, diversity, who go there, they're not even attracted by everyone else.
Okay, I absolutely abhor that type of behaviour in any school, and especially in my school. I have a growing LGBTQ community in my school, which is welcomed. I have a number of transgender students in my school that are welcomed. They are treated like everybody else. I think it is abhorrent to suggest that those things should happen in schools, and if it does, it is stamped on. There was a big Ofsted review only last year looking across all schools, both state and independent, and it found real problems in all those schools, and they put in a lot more processes now. So I've just been inspected only last month by the Independent School Inspectorate, which are themselves inspected by Ofsted, and we were grilled by everything we did, all our policies, procedures. They interviewed groups of students, groups of parents, to check that we're doing what we should do. And every school should be held to account to make sure they are looking after their students and their pupils correctly. Can I just continue? Otherwise, I'm not going to get some. I'll come back to you if I have time. Further, private sector offers social mobility, specialist SEN schools, boarding schools, single-sex schools, music, drama, art, language, sports, specialist schools, schools for all ages, for all colours, races, creeds and religions. Schools, they have financial backing, they have good resources. Private schools are generally successful schools and offer such a range of choices which the state is sadly able to match, as one of our learned friends said earlier. For example, history of art is still taught, and it's taught in my school, because it was saved by the private sector. Private schools, as I said, get involved in partnerships, and those are particularly successful. My learned colleague who's going to talk later, Roshan, incidentally, he was taught by myself and my wife at our school. And he is now an incredibly successful young man, leading a huge number of schools. Surely, he is a force for good. Yes, I accept that private schools could be classed as privileged. But I accept it. But yet, we give very, very generous bursaries and scholarships. Many of 100%, I have to continue. So, to conclude, my experiences tell me that our country has a diverse educational landscape. The differences between state and private schools have become somewhat blurred as all schools adopt the practices of the best. There are great teachers in all types of schools. Education opportunities are available for all. The main difference between a child at a state school and one at a private school, I think, boils down eventually to the amount of capita per person being invested. No one should want to eliminate private schools and to stick with the state sector, as is what everyone wants to level up. To achieve what the private sector does for the other 93% will require colossal investments. Private schools aren't perfect. Some of our alumni have been maybe a force for the bad. But that misses the point. To vote against this motion, you would have to be convinced that no private school can ever make any positive impact in the world. And I would say that you can only hold that view, that you can only vote against the motion, if your opposition to private schools is through sheer ideological stubbornness. Because you will all have seen pupils transformed in private schools. And finally, just think about where you are now. Are you not in an organisation that is privately owned by charitable organisations, initially paid for by private individuals or groups, not the state, charging fees, using bursaries to lower the barrier for students from less prosperous homes, academically selective, drawing some income from endowments? So in effect, you are attending a private school. Are you not a force for good? I think you are. So before you consider your decision, just remember where you are. President, it is easy for me to propose this motion, and I commend it to you.
Thank you, thank you. Order, please. We'll move to our next speaker. Thank you. Thank you. Our second opposition speaker tonight is Robert Vercake. Robert is the author of Posh Boys, How the English Public Schools Ruined Britain. He argues that the educational system has led a privately educated elite to govern Britain and more widely critiques the lack of social mobility. Robert, you have the ears of the House.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak against the motion this evening. I'd like to begin by telling you a story about private schools, England's private schools. And my story begins in the 14th century, when a wealthy nobleman from Hampshire decided to reward the industrious peasant family who worked for him by paying for the education of his son. And of course, in those days, very few people were educated, so this was an exceptional gift. The boy's name was William Wickham, and Wickham seized this opportunity with both his hands. And he went on to study hard. He eventually became Bishop of Winchester. And through his hard work, good counsel, he rose to be Richard II's senior advisor, Chancellor to Richard II. Many years later, William, reflecting on his good fortune, which had taken him from toiling in the fields of Hampshire to the highest office in state, committed himself to repaying that charitable gift. And William, in 1382, founded England's first public school. Public in the sense that it was open to all children, regardless of their family circumstances. But William went further. William constituted statutes which stipulated that 70 poor and indigent children should be educated at Winchester College. And other Christian medieval philanthropists followed in Wickham's footsteps. They founded endowments which schooled impoverished children. Eton, 1441, followed by St. Paul's, Westminster. All these schools started as poor schools for the education of poor children. Harrow and Eton even capped the fees to prevent wealthy parents from sending their children to these schools. And through their links with Oxford and indeed Cambridge, many poor boys, I'm afraid it was boys, girls' education was very much neglected, went on to become movers and shakers of medieval Britain. Public schools, unbelievably, were once the social mobility engines of Britain. They lifted impoverished children to positions of high office in church at the court of kings. By God, they were a force for good. But note the use of the tenants. Because, of course, these schools attracted the attention and jealousies of the aristocracy, the nobles, the landed gentry, the merchant classes, the beneficiaries later of the Industrial Revolution. And these people wanted what these public schools had done for poor children. They wanted this for their own children. So they paid off the trustees of the schools. They instructed their lawyers to rewrite the bursaries, the endowments, the statutes in favor of their own children, and booted out the foundation boys, the charity scholars, so that Britain's public schools were charity in name only. And it's unfortunate, but it's the truth. These schools haven't really changed since then. And you've heard a lot of facts and figures this evening, but this is the truth. 600,000 children attend private schools today. Private schools are booming in this country. Yet, only 1%, that's around 6,000 children, still get a free education at private schools. It's almost the reverse of when William Wickham tried to create a fairer, free education system in this country. And of those 6,000 children who get a totally free education, most of them, almost all of them, are the brightest, trailblazers, role models in the state school system who would have done very well in their state schools, but were poached and taken to gated palaces in the country in order to boost the academic and sporting credentials of the private schools in order to, just make this point, in order to attract high fee-paying families. Take your point.
Were they poached by public schools, or did the students and their parents choose to go to public schools because they offered a better education? Were they stolen,
Yeah.
or did they choose?
Well, I would say I'd say that was the intellectual capital that's been stolen from the state school system. But, I mean, it's very hard to resist an inducement, a bribe, a free education at Eton, I would suggest. I mean, you know, it's very hard to resist that. I would suggest that is theft.
Is a suggestion that private school education be offered to more people so they can be coached, or to fewer people so they can remain in state schools?
I would love all our schools to be just like Eton, in my heavenly dreamland. But give me the money and let's make it happen. Why not? Let's have 12 in a class. Let's have 3 lacrosse pitches per student. I mean, you got the money, let's have it. But let's be realistic as well. It ain't going to happen. So let's deal with the reality. So, private schools are commercial enterprises masquerading as charities, I would argue. And, you know, so far, so probably very familiar. This is a story, an age-old story, isn't it, of the rich riding roughshod over the interest of the poor. We've heard it all before. Except 2 years ago, the world changed. Do you remember? There was a virus that ravished the land. And it was a completely different perspective on society. Communities came together, didn't we? We all came together to fight the virus. Remember, we stood outside our houses applauding key workers, nurses, care workers, supermarket shelf stackers. And once again, private schools, independent schools, public schools, call them what you want, they could have come to be a force for good again. Do you remember how state schools were severely disrupted by the virus? How hundreds of thousands of children were denied a full education? How so many disadvantaged children fell behind in their education? And we asked the private schools to use their resources to try and soften the blow, to help their communities. They could have opened their classrooms to educate more state school children. They could have sent their teachers into the state schools. They could have opened their online teaching programs to state school kids. But what was their response? Their response was to tighten up security, put no trespassing signs on their gates. But most egregious of all, they gamed the exam system. game the exam system by inflating their pupils' grades in GCSEs and A-levels at the expense of state school kids. If...
You spoke in this chamber about 3 years ago, and you said very similar things, and I just...
point of information, didn't. Very different speech. I was there.
At the time, it was exactly the same. Do you have anything to offer that is sort of factual and based on obviously you have class lists and bets and stuff like that?
I don't know whether you want me to apologise or to write you a special speech all of your own, because, I mean, sorry, I've got to conclude now anyway, but thank you for your untimely interjection. So, to conclude, 6 million children in this country grow up in poverty. And they will probably die in poverty, and they will probably go to their graves never knowing there are charities called Eton, Harrow, Winchester, Wellington, who are charities whose sole purpose is to enhance the lives of already very privileged children. Public schools, private schools, independent schools, call them what you will, they used to be a force for good. They used to educate poor children. They do not anymore. I urge you to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. We'll now do another round of floor speeches. Would anyone like to speak in proposition?
Hello, Oliver Eady, Robinson College. This is going to be a really brief one, and it's basically a request for the last speaker of the opposition, is that I'm kind of undecided this when I came in, and essentially the first proposition laid out the possibility of some schools being a force for good. And what essentially is, I think, respectfully has happened on the opposition side is quite cheap shots at the most public institutions that we have, which maybe 95% of people in this room could do easily. So if we could maybe like broaden it out to help me make my decision, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anyone like to speak in opposition of the motion? Over here. Name and college, please. Thank you.
Hello, Lucia at Pembroke College. I mean, we've heard about some really great examples of great things that private schools have done for individual students, but we've also heard, you know, why don't state school students do these same things? Well, that's because state schools have limitations against them, which means that private schools, although they may be getting these better results and whatnot, are doing so on a highly uneven playing field. And I don't just mean the finances, I don't just mean the social class and system side of things. I mean that in 1988, the national curriculum was introduced. I mean that 1980, Ofsted was introduced, and then 1982, SATs were introduced. All of these only applying to state schools, introduced by a majority private school cabinet, potentially even all private schools. I'm not sure, but I'm just going to say majority. What that means was there was a direct tightening of control over state school autonomy because there was worry that state school students, their aspirations were going too high after 1967 Plowden report, for example, promoted individualised education. Which schools nowadays, you know, don't have to follow the national curriculum? Private schools, and that means that they can tailor their lessons to teachers' specialities, students' interests. I remember recently a friend said to me, when I first met you, Lucia, I thought you were privately educated because you were so confident. Is that what private schools are teaching students? I'm not sure. But what it does mean is because they don't have to follow the national curriculum, they can spend time on these other areas that develop students, you know, things like public speaking, all of these extracurriculars that state schools don't have the time to do because they have increased limitations on what they can, on what they have to teach, and teachers are under increasing pressure to, you know, fit that criteria rather than providing a good educational experience. Yes.
Sorry, Lucia, but
it's fine.
Are you advocating here for private schools not being a force for good, or saying we should reform the state school system by introducing these things for everyone? And if you're talking about a legislative perspective and being able to not follow the national curriculum, that doesn't necessarily take funds?
Yeah, No, I mean, I think my point is sort of that private schools are not a force for good because it's on such an uneven playing field and at the expense of so many other students. You know, because we hear these great examples, you know, about, you know, you mentioned the partially sighted student who you were able to offer that for her, but you also talked about choices. She didn't have a choice of which school to go to because yours was the only one that was going to do it, really just proving that your school has an excess. And I don't think excess is a force for good when it is at the disadvantage of so many others. You know, I don't think overwhelmingly the social factors that add up to something being a force for good. And I think there are so many systematic legislative factors in place for state schools to be disadvantaged that to be operating on that playing field at all is not a force for good. It's just blatantly unequal aside from those social outcomes that other speakers have discussed. Yes, hello.
Sorry,
Oh,
I don't think we have time
I'm
for
sorry.
presentation. Thank you. Would anyone like to speak in abstention?
So I'm speaking in abstention of this motion, as I would with pretty much any motion when it comes to discussing the private school versus state school divide, because I feel as though it forces this dichotomy in discussions about our education, which is state versus private. But I think something that's being neglected is the discussion about grammar schools, and the fact that in terms of Oxbridge widening its state school access, in fact it's widening its grammar school access. The increased numbers of state school individuals attending these elite institutions is not necessarily the comprehensive state schools. In fact, it's these grammar schools which have a similar culture to these private schools. So I'm standing in abstention of this motion because I feel as though any discussion about our education, something that's so important to all of us in this room, it should be something more complex. It shouldn't be something just saying it's private schools versus state schools. In fact, this is a really complex issue, and I feel as though motions like this really oversimplify the issue. And I would urge all of us to recognise the complexity and the need to acknowledge diversity in these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We now move to our closing paper speakers. On the proposition, we have Roshan Ghandi closing. Roshan is the CEO of City Montessori School in Lucknow, India, the largest school in the world with over 58,000 students across 19 campuses. A graduate of Oxford and UCL, he speaks extensively on education and the role that technology can play.
Madam President, officers, speakers, members of the House, thank you very much to the Cambridge Union. It's an honor to be here today. We focus now largely on the system that we are most familiar with, or most of us in the room, that is the UK education system, though I'm grateful to our Finnish friend for bringing in one outside perspective. However, today's motion does not invite us to debate the merits of UK private schooling, but whether private schooling is a force for good in general. And with this in mind, I invite the House to cast your minds to India, and I will bring it back to the UK. But think of India, where there are approximately 250 million students of school-going age, and where I happen to work in the schooling sector. Now, unlike here, where just under 7% of students attend private schools, you may be surprised to learn that around 50% of Indian students are enrolled in private schools. And this has been a consistently rising trend, with the exception of the pandemic. From about 2010 to 2018, 20 million children migrated from government schools to private schools. And this is despite the fact that government school places are universally accessible, they are available, and it is also despite the fact that government school students get not only free education, but also free textbooks, free uniforms, free lunch meals, costs which to the typical Indian household are actually really rather significant. This phenomenon of migration from public to private is largely a result of the abysmal quality of provision in the government schools. In a recent study, it was found that 25% of 14 to 18-year-olds in government schools could not read basic text in their own language. 57% of them could not do basic division and multiplication and things like that. In international benchmarking tests, such as the PISA tests, India's educational outcomes have ranked almost at the bottom, 72 out of 73 countries, the last time they participated. With no accountability mechanism, teachers are chronically absent, so on any given day across India, about 25% of government school teachers will be absent. In some states, that's as high as 42%. Even those who are in school are often found, unfortunately, running side businesses on the phone or just socializing or sleeping. Teachers are also found unable to answer simple questions in the subjects that they are supposed to teach. In many states, fewer than 10% of teachers pass the teacher eligibility tests. And part of the reason for this problem is an entrenched problem of teacher unionization. So during elections, government school buildings are used as the polling booths. Government teachers are deployed as the government employees who sort of run those polling booths. And in a place where systems are not so robust, there is a fear that teachers therefore have a very strong power to influence election outcomes. And that fear makes their collective bargaining power extremely strong, which keeps them free of any accountability to perform in their job. This has also caused teacher pay to rise to unsustainably high levels. So, I'm all in favor of paying teachers well, but I'm sure everyone in the House would also agree that, anyone's pay in any profession should remain reasonable. In the UK, teacher pay on average is approximately the same as GDP per capita, whatever the average income teachers earn about that. Now, there may be a case to raise that. That's a discussion for another time. But that's the reality here. In China, where educational outcomes are very good, it's even less than that. It's about 0.9 times. But in India, unionization has inflated government salaries to 8 to 9 times GDP per capita, despite the teachers' complete lack of output. And this, the entire education budget is pumped into teacher salaries, which completely, there are no resources for anything else that goes with an education system. Now, most private schools, on the other hand, are affordable and low cost. So 70% of private school students pay less than 1,000 rupees per month. That's £10 per month in school fees. About 50% pay less than £5 per month. The median private school fee rate is less than £5 per month, while the median per pupil expenditure in government schools is about £11 per month. So for achieving the same or better learning outcomes, private schools achieve over twice the value for money as compared to government schools. And in some states where private schools are particularly low fee and government school spending is particularly inefficient, private schools provide as high as 29 times the value for money that government schools do. So the evidence is quite clear then that in a context such as India's, private schools are not only a force for good, they are an absolutely essential provider of education, without which there would be no education worth speaking of. The government has a long track record of failure to provide. The state lacks the administrative capacity to reform its education provision. And issues such as the unionization I talked about mean that these problems remain entrenched and sort of unsolvable. Meanwhile, the private schools provide affordable education of a better quality for a drastically lower cost. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you then saying that affordable private schools in India are inaccessible to no one?
Yeah, pretty much, because it's becoming such a market-driven system that private schools are coming up in every locality which are affordable to all the people of that locality. So, whatever the minimum wage, whatever the really lowest earning people earn, they are able to actually afford a low-cost private school. So, what I'm saying is that in India, as an example, the only education worth speaking of is thanks to private school. Now, while I've taken India's example just because it happens to be the one I'm most familiar with, this is by no means a uniquely Indian phenomenon. Similar patterns, to varying extents, prevail in many middle-income and developing countries, places where state capacity is low, many countries across South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. So for much of the world, for billions of children, private schools are the essential providers of schooling, without which the standard of education would inevitably plummet. In some places, government schooling systems are so bleak that there are even calls made for the abolition of government education rather than the abolition of private schools. Now, personally, I disagree with such calls, because I do believe that education is a public good. I do believe it is the duty of the state to provide education. I'm proud that free and compulsory education is enshrined in India's constitution. Education is essential to human flourishing. I think it's a prerequisite to a well-functioning democracy, and therefore must be provided by the state. But the state providing education does not necessarily mean that the state must take responsibility for the operating of schools. Other models are possible. So, for example, the state can fund education on the demand side by providing vouchers to parents, which they can exercise free choice to avail in any relevant school of their choice. So it's possible for private operators to run schools, and in many places they have a track record of being able to do so far better than government can, while the government continues to take responsibility for ensuring universal access to education, irrespective of household income. And such schemes have been successful in a variety of contexts, ranging from Chile to Sweden, and variations on that model have been successful in Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Estonia, and elsewhere. Now, back home in the UK, considering that we do fortunately have a fairly successful high-outcome government school system, it would not make sense to advocate for alternative models quite such as these. But the wider argument that I've made is that if you take an example like India, an ideological stance in favor of the abolition of private schools would simply destroy whatever education exists. There's so many gaps in the state provision that there need to be private players to fill those gaps to provide education. Now, that argument can actually be extended to the UK, where obviously the gaps in the state education system are much, much less. There is a good, strong state education system, but there are still gaps nonetheless. As we heard about the special education needs, for example, where so many children don't have that access to what they need in the state system, private schools are there to fill those gaps. In certain localities around the country, it simply hasn't been a high-quality state school that has come up. Private schools are there and can potentially fill those gaps. On the point about privilege, it's an unfortunate reality of people of privilege, perhaps, that they will always find ways to exercise those privileges. So even if there weren't a private school in that locality, people would be looking to private tuitions, to the use of different ed tech companies, to education technology provisions, giving their children opportunities through other means, even if it's not just through the school means. Yeah. All right, I'll wrap up then. I just want to say that private schools do play one more important role universally. That's whether here in the UK or in any of the other places I've mentioned, which is similar to one of the points that someone on the floor was making earlier. Private schools retain a certain freedom and independence to allocate their own resources in their own way and pursue their own curriculum patterns. Now, state schools are full of brilliant, creative, innovative teachers just as much as private schools are, but unfortunately in state schools they are somewhat constrained from exercising that creativity to its fullest potential, because state schools have to conform to relatively inflexible definitions of what constitutes good standards of teaching, while private schools can afford to offer teachers more support to experiment freely with teaching methods and practices. But the thing is that it is this freedom to experiment from which new teaching and learning practices are developed. And this ultimately leads to new understanding of what is best practice. And over time, these best practices gets transmitted across the education sector. So to its great credit, the state education system in the UK has developed a culture of knowledge sharing. Teachers really professionally develop by learning from each other's best practices. But the creation of new best practices happens far more readily in environments where curriculum content and resource allocation is less rigid, which of course means here the private schools. The creative work that takes place in these environments raises standards of education for all students across both private and state schools. So in conclusion, I repeat that for much of the world, private education is not only desirable, but is the essential provider of education without which there would be no viable education. And also that whether in the UK or anywhere else, standards of education are uplifted for everyone by creative teachers experimenting with developing new practices, which the independence of private schools empower them to do far more. So there can be no doubt then that private schools are a force for good, whether one interprets the motion from an international or a national lens. I wholeheartedly endorse, of course, the arguments put forward by my honourable friends proposing the motion, and I commend this motion to the House. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roshan. We now move to our last paper speaker of the evening. Order, please. Order. Thank you on our last speaker. Our last speaker is Jamie Louise Charles. Jamie is a second-year psychological and behavioural sciences student and the president of Corpus Christi College, JCR. Jamie, the floor is yours.
So, anyone that knows me might expect me to stand here and be in a fit of rage about how much I dislike private schools. They would expect me to be telling you how they're the worst thing on earth. However, that's not going to do much for me this evening. My fellow speakers on the opposition have done a very good job at explaining why private schools are bad. So I'd like to take a slightly different approach to interpreting the motion this evening. As soon as I read it, I was obviously like, private schools are bad, obviously. But the motion tonight isn't asking if private schools are bad, they're asking if they're good. So I won't delve further into convincing you that they're bad, even though I definitely think they are. I will simply posit that they are not good. So you might think, Jamie, that's a bit embarrassing because not good is the same as bad. As one of the propositions said, the opposite of good is bad. These are synonyms. You're clutching at straws here. And to that, I would say, keep your black and white thinking to yourself. Instead, I would like you all to realize that just because something is not good does not necessarily mean it is bad, although I personally think it is. And I believe the sentiment I want to deliver to the House tonight is that at the very, and I mean very most, private schools, if you're considering the diversity of them, the ones that are low fee paying, the ones that help children with special educational needs, they are at the very, 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 very most mid. This is what I'm about to go on to. So for any members of the House that aren't familiar with the term mid, I'll describe it to you. It is something that is neither particularly good nor particularly bad. You might say neutral, but I just don't think that captures it. So that is mid for all of you. So people pay thousands of pounds for their children to go to private schools. Why do they do that? Well, because they're supposed to give you an advantage in life. When I first learned about private schools, I was like, I want to do all that sick stuff. That's not fair. I want to do it. I want to go. I want to have that advantage. And then I actually took some time to reflect and realized that it's not fair. But regardless, I think that private schools aren't actually overly good for their students, never mind those that are excluded from them. Of course, we've heard the exceptional circumstances of schools that are designed to help students with special educational needs, but I'm talking on the broader scale. I'm talking the students that go to a private school because that's what their family do. I'm talking about every broad possible perception of a private school. So, a force for good is a very hyperbolic term, and I just don't agree with it. I think there aren't many things you could actually say is only a force for good. You could even say, and I apologise to the Labour Party, I wouldn't even say the Labour Party can be considered solely a force for good, even though I am a Labour supporter. I think this is such an overly generalised term. So anyway, I think the impact of private schools, the direct impact that they have on their students, and the overall success they give to their students is massively overstated. And instead of being good, of course, their influence is mid. And before I start, and this is quite timely with Oliver's request, thank God I'd already prepared something, I wanted to call on everyone in the chamber tonight that are thinking of abstaining. So it's time for the Lib Dems to take the splinters out of their arse and finally make a decision. As I said, a force for good, it's very hyperbolic. And I think if you have any indifference towards this motion, then that signals your disagreement. If you are capable of understanding, yes, we have a diverse range of implications of these schools. They are helpful for some, they hurt others. I think you should be walking through the Noes this evening. By refuting the perceived benefits of these private schools, I will hope to demonstrate to even the fiercest defenders of private schools that they cannot be considered a force for good, even for their own students. So, private schools, as we know, they're supposed to set you up for success. And as we have probably all heard, only 7% of the population are privately educated, yet they make up 74% of senior judges, 71% of senior officers in the armed forces, and 50% of cabinet ministers. And we assume that this is their schooling that determines these positive outcomes. However, I want to suggest that it is not that direct schooling that gives rise to this success. It's factors such as the economic and social background. The role of private schools in this operation of privilege is mid. I don't know why you're laughing, it's serious. So what happens if we abolish private schools? Educational inequality will still persist. You would have to be very, very naive to think that it would just disappear overnight. You can hire a private tutor. If the abolition of the institution itself does not abolish further unfair educational advantage, then it is not the driving force behind it. The role of schools is to be there, to be mid. They are benefiting, that their students are benefiting, but not directly from their input, and therefore the success and the advantage that we deem as so unfair is not wholly attributable to them, but instead to other sources. So the role of private schools has been analysed by von Stum and Plomin in 2020. I'll mention it because I'm a psychologist, which is a science. Thank you. And after doing some mad statistical stuff, the authors concluded that once considering your family background and prior educational achievement, attending a private school is of very little benefit to students and can also have a potentially negative impact on aspects of our development. Yeah.
This contradicts about the first opposition. He said the opposite. In fact, studies do show that they are effective, creating better educational outcomes.
But this is when you control for those background factors, prior educational achievement, these social... Well, as in all science, there's always going to be disagreement. This is what I found. Don't come at me. It was in 2020. That's pretty recent, so... Good sources. But thank you. So... This paper essentially posits, and I believe wholeheartedly, that the benefits of private schooling are a result of their selective intake, rather than the value that the school adds.
Wasn't Pullman the same guy who did DNA screening to see whose genes would give them better GCSE scores and advocate for
I don't know. Potentially, I don't know. But anyway, regardless. So it's not the teaching that make these schools so good, if you will. It's the type of students they admit, those from primarily wealthy families. Our expectation is that the impact of private education is actually quite unrealistic, and the observed benefits are instead the consequence of a legacy of family privilege. Private schools do not provide these advantages directly. They are afforded to students by their background and their connections, meaning that at the very most, the role of the schooling is mid. regardless of whether Tarquin goes to a private school or not, Mummy will still collect him from lacrosse practice in her Range Rover, and Daddy's friends at the firm will still get him a consultancy internship in year 10 for work experience. I don't think you can simply say that the schooling itself is what is giving this advantage, if we can term this advantage as something that is a force for good. No, sorry, actually. Sorry, I ain't got time. So the private schooling itself is simply a byproduct of economic privilege. It's just there, it's just mid. And interestingly, there are potential negative consequences of attending a private school. In comparison to their state school counterparts, privately educated students are 15% more likely to experience bullying over their secondary education, and you really don't have to look very far to the testimonies of the serious abuse that can go on in independent schools. Moreover, privately educated students are likely to take risks, more likely to take risks, and are younger when they have their first alcoholic drink. Unsurprisingly as well, private school students, on average, lose their virginity later in life than state school counterparts. And these things may be considered worth the extra grades. They may be considered, a small sacrifice, if you will. But surely these things do not make your list of top 10 things I like to find in a force for good. In sum, the extent to which private school benefits we assume that they give is massively overstated. They're explained by other factors. The role of the private school is at best mid, and it's actually can have negative effects on the pupil's social experiences. It doesn't sound like a force to good for me. Moving on from this, I really just wanted to make a little point on the social exclusivity seen in their cohorts. I don't think it's particularly good for their students. So our apartheid education system doesn't make much sense when we are all able to appreciate, when you come to university, the diversity in who we meet teaches us so much. I have, for example, learnt that you can do GCSEs in Latin. And some of my privately educated friends have learned how universal credit works. And why is it that you would just not send your child to a school in which they can actually get to know people? You can keep your economic privilege. You'll probably still take Tarquin to his lacrosse practice. You'll probably still get extra tuition because you can afford it. Imagine if our politicians actually interacted with the roadmen in London. Imagine if they witnessed the impact of poverty and could humanize the refugees and immigrants that they've turned away. I think these people in government that are largely privately educated could benefit from being integrated with the rest of society. People in these government roles cannot properly represent a nation from which they have been divided. In essence, keeping the circle small may not be damaging, but it may hold back these potential politicians from doing a much better job. And contrary to popular belief, walking through the Noes this evening does not signify an allegiance to left radicalism. It does not mean that you want to eat the rich. It doesn't even mean you think that private schools should be abolished. Walking through the Noes does not mean that you can't, Walking through the Noes means that you can acknowledge the nuance that this debate offers. It means we can look at the potential positive impacts of private schooling on their pupils, as for neurodiverse individuals. But I actively encourage you to walk through the Noes this evening if you are the most fiercest defender of private schools ever, because does good quite cut how you feel about your private school? No, I don't think so. In sum, this is a very sweeping generalization to say that private schools are a force for good. Walking through the Noes simply acknowledges that these institutions are not a force that is wholly good, and instead appreciates this nuance, both the good, the bad, and the mid. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you all for a wonderful debate. In this house, we vote with our feet, go through the I door, the no door, or through the middle for abstention. The results have been announced in the bar. Thank you.